Hi, Chuka Umunna, who's the Managing Director, Head of EMEA, Europe and Middle East and Africa, LVSG, is joining us today to talk about what he's doing at JP Morgan and what JP Morgan is doing around this area of ESG, green finance, and frankly, addressing climate change, which is the whole theme of this conference. Chuka, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a great privilege. Now, tell us the story first. You found yourself in this extraordinary spot in this institution, helping to drive change. How is it fitting? You know, especially given your past career, you've been very forthright and very strong on the need to address climate change. How is that playing out, and what are you actually doing at JP Morgan?
Well, it's the other side of the fence of actually trying to change the world, I suppose. And I don't want it to sound too grand, but that's what this bank is in the business of doing. I think very often what we do in the financial services sector is painted as being remote or mainly revolving around the concerns of the top 1% of income in all our different economies. But the truth is, when you look at an institution like this, and you're right to refer to the size of an institution, you know, by some measure, on some measures, we're the biggest bank in the world, 255,000 employees globally. Just here in London, where I'm sitting, we've got 12,000 people. Tens of millions of Americans directly or indirectly owning part of this bank, a huge supply chain, wholesale and retail. It is a significant institution in society. And it's all of those interests that are wrapped into what we do as a business. So far from, you know, this kind of big, you know, power structure for a small number of people. Actually, what a bank like this is all about is ultimately it's about people, it's about jobs, prosperity, all the different businesses all over the globe. So it's a tremendous privilege, and it's the other side of the coin, I suppose. I come from a kind of public policy background, having served as a member of parliament here, and I was a UK shadow business secretary. But this is the other side of the equation, where that essential partnership between the public and the private sector come together to try and tackle some of the big issues we face in the world. So I kind of see it as being part of a continuum.
En el sector público y ahora estoy trabajando al otro lado, en el sector privado. Para mí fue parte de una transición. Así es importante considerar la relevancia de estas instituciones. Estamos hablando de grandes volúmenes de capital.
And our public resources are more soaked up by dealing with pandemics, dealing with Hurricane Ida in New Orleans, and the impacts of climate change, the emergencies as a result of heat and rain. So where we can use private capital, we need to, and of course that's what a bank is, the bridge between private capital and the solutions for climate change. Of course,
you know what, Sean, actually, you're right to talk about solutions, because I think the refreshing thing coming out of this crisis, this dreadful COVID-19 crisis that we've been living through over the last 18 to 24 months. One of the refreshing things coming out of this, relative to coming out of the last big global crisis, which some would say was the global financial crash of 2008-9, is whereas after that event, and when finance was seen as very much the root of the problem, I think coming out of this crisis, there has been a change, and finance is seen as very much being part of the solution to some of the big problems that we have faced. That's in part because if you look across the different components of the sector, the different industries within it, in aggregate, it is seen to have delivered the goods for society when it needed that support through these difficult times, providing debt finance, for example, to businesses, helping with cash flow to see them through the lockdowns, to such an extent that trust levels in the financial services sector as a whole are as high as they were just before the global financial crash. And as people look towards the ongoing looming climate catastrophe we face, there is absolutely no doubt about it that finance has a key role to play, because of, not least, you know, the fiscal debt and deficit hangover that governments face globally post-COVID mean that, never mind in ordinary circumstances not being able to foot the bill for greening our economies, it is nigh on impossible for it to do so, given the residue and the aftermath of this dreadful thing that we've been going through. So you will only get the capital needed, that 3.5 to 5 trillion, depending on where you get your figures every year, to green our economies, to prevent a bigger catastrophe, which is worth reminding people is, people are forecast will kill more people every year than COVID has over the last 18 months if we don't get to where we need to be by 2050.
That's the sober reality, and I think one of the heartening things. Sorry,
it's sobering when you think of it in those terms.
It's really, really sobering, isn't it? One of the heartening things about this year has been the commitment by major economies to 2030 targets, which the IPC said are as important as 2050, especially when it comes to methane and needing to get methane down, which has become a horror story over the last 10 years, as the IPCC report of a couple of weeks ago tells us. That means the short term. So it's not just deals in the 2040s. We've got to get a lot of stuff done in the next 8 years or 9 years or so. Tell us a little bit more. Tell us a little bit about what you found is exciting about what JP Morgan's doing and gives you hope, because I know you're aware of the problems. We need to have a story of hope here.
I think that, well, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. I think the important thing is for all of us who made commitments and have said how, for example, Jamie Dimon, our CEO, said in his annual letter to shareholders this year how, we want to tackle these big challenges of inequality, race inequality, above all, climate. But it's really important that you back up what you say with action. So you don't just talk the talk, but you walk the walk too. And on that measure, we have made huge strides forward as a bank. We've already, in 2020, we achieved operational carbon neutrality, and we've committed to doing so again every year going forward. We financed initiatives to help green our economies and build a more sustainable future to the tune of $200 billion last year. So we were already doing things which, put us on the path to where we want to be and the contribution that we want to make. And that culminated this year in big, bold, ambitious targets, arguably the biggest commitments of any bank in the world. And there's really two parts to this. One is to align our financing portfolio with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we have set out...
Sorry, align the financing portfolio, as in lending and so on. That's right. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And we've set out a methodology outlining how we will achieve that. And we've identified the sectors that we will seek to work with in the first instance to get to that goal. And we haven't picked the easiest sectors. We've picked oil and gas, electrical power, and automotive as the starting points for that. In addition to that, and I can talk more about how that works, in addition to that, we've committed over the next 10 years to financing or facilitating finance to the tune of $2.5 trillion to further the goals of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and to help contribute to the climate transition. So those are really big, bold commitments, but they're rooted in the fact that we know we can achieve these things based on our record. And also we know we need to be ambitious if we're all to get to where we want to get to and prevent the climate emergency, catastrophe that we've just been talking about.
So they're pretty impressive goals. I mean, of course, JP Morgan is an institution in the turning, especially the lending portfolio. And it's interesting that you've picked out those areas which are high carbon sectors, particularly oil and gas and auto. I'm going to call them sectors in need of a rapid transition. And as you know, Chuka, is one of the reasons because of course we've been privileged to get JP Morgan as a sponsor. Everything about what we're doing this week is we're focusing hard on transitions. And our last day of this conference will be very focused on how we do tackle these tough sectors, because we've got to make them all shift. We can't do without steel. We can't do without concrete. We just need to be zero carbon instead of high carbon, and so on. So what are you seeing about the appetite for change in this area, both on the investor side and then most importantly on the corporate side? What are people telling you?
Well, the difficult sectors that we chose.
En base a estos objetivos, el apetito del mercado. Hemos seleccionado estos sectores que son bastante difíciles, bastante complejos, porque pueden tener un impacto mayor.
applied by actors in those
Ha
sectors.
sido un
And
buen
also,
punto
although
de
they're not
arranque
perfect, there is a
y hemos
decent data set
identificado
that
ya
we
rutas
can
de
work with
transición.
there. And of
Diferentes
course,
actores de esos
whilst
sectores
those,
han
take
identificado
oil and gas, what those
rutas
companies are doing
de
is
acción
bigger
y es
in
importante
other
saber que
companies and other
podemos trabajar
sectors,
con
supply
esos
chains as well. So
sectores.
they're going to
Pero en el
affect
caso
the
de petróleo y
ability
gas,
of those companies to transition
ese
as well.
sector
I think one of
también
the
tendrá un
most
impacto en
difficult
las cadenas de
things
suministro de
for
otros
corporates,
sectores
and
y no
this
va a
isn't just in
ayudar a
oil
la
and gas,
transición
but
de esos
across the board,
sectores.
is if you like the fact
Pero
that to some
una cosa muy
extent
difícil
what we've
para las
been
grandes
doing in the
empresas, y no solo
sustainability
de
and
petróleo y
ESG
gas,
space has been, how can I put it, a
es
little
la
bit
importancia
Wild
de
West, because
reconocer
and a
que
lot of it
desde
has
el
been
punto de
marketed really
vista
well. And
de
by the way, I think that's very
sostenibilidad,
encouraging.
desde la
You
perspectiva
mentioned,
ESG, es más o menos
and it will have
como en la
been
época
mentioned
del
throughout this
viejo
event,
oeste.
how we've
Estamos
seen record
abriendo
inflows into
terreno.
sustainable and
Y
ESG
como usted
funds,
mencionó
and
a lo largo del evento,
the amount of assets held
el
in
lanzamiento de
ESG
estos
debt
bonos
instruments is much higher than
sostenibles
it's ever been before. And it's worth reflecting on the fact that that has happened
y el
despite the fact that one
volumen
of the biggest
que
economies,
forma
not just the
parte
last
de
5 or
este
6 years, you've
mercado.
had, the most
Esto
anti-sustainability,
es muy
anti-ESG
interesante
administration
y ha crecido
possible. And in spite of that, the
mucho
market's been driving
los
growth.
últimos
So I think
5 o
that's
6
a
años,
very
pese
encouraging
a
thing. But
que
the lack of
hayamos
action, in
tenido
some
un
respects, by
gobierno
the
en los
public sector has
Estados
meant it has
Unidos
been a bit of the Wild West. And
totalmente
for a
contrario
corporate issuer,
a
that
esta
means
agenda
you're
los últimos
navigating a
5
plethora
años.
of different ESG and
Y esto
sustainability
desde la
ratings
perspectiva
agencies,
de
which have
un
their own
emisor
methodologies and
empresarial.
practices and ways of operating.
Es
You've got
interesante
numerous different global standards and
ver
frameworks. And although
que estamos
arguably, I'd
en
say
un ambiente
SASB,
que muchas veces
TCFD, and
puede ser
GRI are
contrario, pero
emerging as
estamos
the
trabajando en un
three
mundo
most
con
used. There are a
distintos
number of others, and
marcos, reglas
specific
y
ones for
estándares,
different
pero que tienen
sectors. And then
apetito por eso.
the third
O
thing is
sea,
obviously
que hay una serie de
difficulties with
distintos
getting
sectores y
valid
estándares
data. Now, that's obviously easier
que implican otras
when you're looking
dificultades
at
para
the
obtener
environmental-based and the
datos
social
correctos.
space. But obviously, I'd argue that
Y
there is a very
eso
strong
es
connection
más
between the
fácil
S and E
cuando
of
pensamos en
ESG, for
datos
example. And
ambientales
so I think
y
for
datos
corporate
sociales.
issuers, that is increasingly a challenge, particularly in the mid
En la,
amongst the mid caps and the kind of
y
mid-market, because
principalmente
the larger, your Dow
si
Industrials or
pensamos en los
your FTSE
mercados
100s
promedio,
your DAX, these large, the
y
very
si
largest
pensamos
corporates
en
nowadays
los
very often will have their own
distintos
in-house
índices, estamos hablando
sustainability and or
de
ESG
grandes
capability,
empresas
staffed with subject matter experts who are
y que
skilled and
tienen
have
en
the knowledge to
realidad
be able to collect the
una
data, do the
gran
right disclosures.
capacidad de
But if you're
realizar
a smaller
cambios
outfit, you will
que,
not necessarily
y
have
ellos también
that
tienen un
in-house
equipo capaz de
capability. You're
recolectar
probably,
datos, publicar
and I'm obviously
informes.
generalizing,
Estamos
at an
hablando de
earlier
empresas
stage in your
pequeñas,
sustainability and
muchas de las
ESG
cuales no
journey.
tienen esta capacidad interna
And that
de
makes it all the harder
divulgar
to be
datos
able
y
to
hacer
do
todos
and
esos
meet the
estudios,
increasing demands
lo
of
que
investors.
hace
And
que
investors,
sea
I'm not
todavía
arguing that
más
investors shouldn't
complicado
be
que
making
esas
this demand,
empresas
but
hagan la
definitely the kind of
transición
the
y
things that corporates are being
dificulte
asked
el
to do
que
is much more
las
intensive
empresas
nowadays than it was even just 2
alcancen o
years ago.
lleguen a los inversionistas y
Things have changed, haven't
satisfagan
they?
sus
And that
necesidades.
part of it
De
is
todos modos, eso
certainly a
está
change that
cambiando y
doesn't excite
hoy
me.
es mucho más fácil que hace
We
2
know
o
what
3
the
años.
solutions
Así
are.
es,
We,
el mercado
as
está
you say, there've been laid
cambiando,
out
todo está
pathways being laid out
cambiando
in these sectors.
y
We
sabemos
kind of
cuáles
have
son
the
las
couple elements
soluciones
getting
y
key.
como
We kind
dijiste,
of just need to
las
deliver them,
rutas se han establecido ya
which
para
is not as
distintos
simple as saying,
sectores
place the
y
money. It's
sabemos que las fuentes de
constructing viable
capital
propositions and so on. So
están
I guess
interesadas
JP
y hay
Morgan
que
is
fomentar
convinced
o
the
inducir estos
2.5
cambios. No
criteria
es
and
tan
so on.
fácil, pero
How
sabemos
much is
que
the deal flow
tiene que
following
ser hecho.
fast enough? I mean,
Entonces,
about the
ya
urgency
tenemos
level.
todos
I
estos
mean,
compromisos de la
do
JP
you see a
Morgan,
lot of door knocking on your door saying, help us do
pero mi
this, we want to do
pregunta
this? Or
es,
is it a matter of fact
¿cómo
that you've got to spend
podemos
a lot of time going out
acelerar
and educating
este
people about
proceso?
how to do
Vemos
this?
que
Where are we at in the
muchos
market?
The internal and
lo están
external
haciendo,
demand has
pero
been
¿cómo lo
absolutely
hace la
huge,
JP
and it's
Morgan?
grown exponentially.
Tenemos
The
una
ESG
demanda
solutions group,
interna
which
y
was set up
externa
in the
que
summer of
crece
last year in the corporate
exponencialmente.
investment bank here, and I co-lead
Tenemos un
ESG advisory
grupo
globally with my colleague Randy
que
Clary in New
fue
York.
creado el año pasado
Was set
y
up
que
as
trata
a pilot project in
exactamente
many
de eso
respects, but
en
it
los
was
Estados
sponsored by
Unidos.
need and internal
En
demand.
realidad fue
And
un
the
proyecto
demand has been
piloto
huge, and that is why we're in the
por
process of scaling
títulos
up the
y
team.
respecto a la
We
demanda
also set up the
esperada,
Centre for
pues
Carbon
superó
Transition in
nuestras expectativas. Tuvimos incluso que ampliar nuestro equipo y crear un grupo de transición de carbono en octubre para ocuparse específicamente de esos sectores que había mencionado, sectores intensivos en emisiones de carbono para auxiliar en este proceso de transición. Y ya estamos trabajando con expertos del sector y también en este caso la demanda ha crecido de manera exponencial. Y esto, bueno, y estamos pensando cómo podemos alcanzar nuestras metas dentro del plazo esperado. Veo muchas cosas positivas sucediendo y conversando con mi equipo esta semana, algunos que ingresaron en JP Morgan en el 2021 y a menudo en mis conversaciones con los clientes me doy cuenta de que en ciertas empresas quienes sugieren estas ideas son el CFO y no necesariamente la persona responsable de sostenibilidad en la empresa. Y esto para nosotros es importante saber que si conseguimos convencer al presidente de la empresa o al director general financiero, todo esto ayudará a convencer al consejo de administración de la empresa y en un segundo momento podemos hablar con el jefe o el director de sostenibilidad de la empresa. Pero así es, será útil para operativizar nuestra relación con la empresa, lo que naturalmente basándome en mi experiencia, si conseguimos convencer a los jefes de las empresas, vamos a ayudar a cambiar la trayectoria de la empresa. Hace 10 años,
it wasn't called ESG in those days. Actually, very often it was conflated with corporate social responsibility and talk about purpose, etc. But it was very much seen as a niche topic by the kind of do-gooder small minority in the business community. This just was not seen as a mainstream issue. And the types of things that and statements and commitments you see given in the ESG and sustainability reports now, back then, that would have just seemed really out of step with where the consensus view was. This would have been painted as kind of fairly radical and a move towards a kind of command control way of running an economy and businesses getting involved in wider societal issues that they had no place in involving themselves in. I mean, it is so dramatic, the change in the kinds of conversations you're having with business leaders now. And obviously, there's been a lot that has happened since. You know, COVID has had an enormous effect on the way in which I think corporates are seen in society and their role. The aftermath of the austerity that followed the global financial crash itself, and the overall impact of globalization and how it has driven a lot more insecurity for individuals, I think has really forced a change. And maybe without that, and the history I've just outlined, you perhaps wouldn't get the determination and the realization that this climate thing, you can't just put on hold and pass the buck and say it's not our responsibility. I think it stands to reason that it just has become mainstream because there's been this evolution. It's been fascinating to watch, actually, really fascinating to watch.
And in terms of those issues that you mentioned, what are the challenges they face in doing something in this area? What are you finding? The corporates I'm talking about.
I think inevitably, and I have to confess that, you know, the various different stories you read about controversies emerging from how particularly people on the buy side label ESG products, what is really ESG and sustainable and what isn't. I remember actually making this point on a webinar a year ago or so on how I really thought this had the potential to become, you know, a new mis-selling scandal, a really big problem. And this arises, of course, because, you know, it's fairly, as I think you've observed, it's a fairly unregulated space so far. It's been, you know, kind of the market marking its own homework, if you like. But I think, you know, ensuring that you're applying the right standards when you're selling products, certainly on the buy side, it does what it says on the tin. You've got rigorous third-party assurance on whether or not you're meeting KPIs. I think all of that type of thing is now going to come much more into focus. And clearly, you know, Gary Gensler, the SEC, the FCA here in the UK, the various EU regulatory authorities are now looking at this more closely. And that's right. As the market matures, it's not something we should be alarmed at. Isn't it a reason to say, oh, look, the ESG, the steam is coming out of the ESG train? I don't think that's the case. I think what we're seeing is symptomatic of a new maturing space. And if it doesn't mature, then we're not going to get, the kind of market that we need to do the job in the future. And the fact it's maturing is a sign of more money coming in, which is what we need to get the funding needed that we've talked about.
So one of the things that JP Morgan has been criticised from the past is that it's still got fossil fuel lending, which you're responding a little bit by saying you're working with the O&G sector and high carbon sectors to the transition. Do you find people understand this idea? I mean, we've had this, I spoke to one major institutional investor last week who was telling us that they couldn't vote on the Exxon resolution because they divested. And you're sort of thinking, well, that was a good reason to engage rather than divest.
Well, this is the really interesting thing, actually. And it just in the last, Sean, you tell me what you're seeing here, because I'm finding amongst investors that simply divesting is becoming more and more of a controversial proposition.
Yeah.
Because it is seen as passing the buck. It is seen as washing your hands of responsibility for trying to bring about change. Whereas I think actually, even just a year ago, it was seen as a legitimate tool to be used as and when you wanted in some cases. I think it's much more of a controversial avenue down which to go now. The question is much more, well, what are you going to do to change things? And what form of engagement are you going to deploy with an issuer to get to where you need to get to? So I think that's been very interesting. Look, on our own record, what I would say is this: I think people need to be realistic and also appreciate the history here. Of course, a bank with the balance sheet the size of JP Morgan, a bank that is the size of JP Morgan, is going to have had a long-standing relationship with large companies that have provided millions of jobs, have contributed to rising living standards, and were part of an industrial revolution over time, over decades, long before we knew that greenhouse gas emissions had the kind, were around and had the kind of effect on the planet. So, it stands to reason that, of course, we're going to have had that kind of history because we're in the business of helping businesses and supporting jobs and prosperity. And unfortunately, that is what these companies have been doing without necessarily knowing the damage to the environment. Now, the important thing is not the history, but what are you going to actually do about it? Now, we could go one of two ways. We could just dump the stock to the extent that we have any involvement in that respect. We don't particularly do, but we could certainly dump the clients if we wanted and refuse to finance any clients in that space. And you can bet your bottom dollar that others would come into the space who don't care about the environment, who would happily finance polluting activities and businesses. Now, in pursuing that avenue, would we be helping the environment or not? Of course we wouldn't be doing anything to help the environment. We'd just be washing our hands, some might say greenwashing, and walking away from the problem. We would much more prefer to work with our clients to transition. And you know what? We have met no resistance from any client who's not interested in doing that, because never mind the societal impact, financially, if you look at the financials of our clients, in the long term, going down this avenue is going to be absolutely dreadful for their shareholders, going down the avenue of not transitioning. And so that is very much what we would prefer to do, is work with our clients, help them raise the finance they will need to fund the innovations and technologies that will get those clients to where they need to be. So, and people often forget that, I think the IEA is estimating that a third of the emissions reduction envisaged by Paris will come from new technology, many of which haven't even been invented yet. Now, where are you going to get the funding for those new technologies if we don't put our skills and resources on the table to help make that happen, which is what we're in the business of doing. So I think that's a far better avenue down which we've got to go. Can I just make a further point, actually?
Yeah.
This is where I think the E goes together very much with the S. It's got to be a just transition.
Yeah, good point.
If, the environmental activists want to get to where we need to get to, it's going to require legislation, public policy measures, some of which we might not like. But you can only get there, I can tell you as somebody who's been in public policy and been in a legislature, if you get a degree of widespread public support. Now, if half your country thinks that going down the Green Avenue is going to lead to a loss of their jobs, a loss of their prosperity, a loss of opportunities for future generations and their families, they are not going to vote for it. And so we have to get the S part right in this E equation. And that means ensuring that we are also building new industries and jobs in places where carbon emitting industries are going to obviously die out and be kind of, reduce their activities. We're going to need to put new industries and new jobs in to replace those jobs. Otherwise, it's just a zero-sum, the way half the population sees it is a zero-sum game. And if you look at all the public polling on this, the long and the short of it is, as great and as wonderful an advocate for a generation as Greta Thunberg may be, she doesn't speak for every single Briton, she doesn't speak for every single American, she doesn't speak for every single person in every single country. And so to get the kind of public support, it has to be seen as a trust transition, both within countries and between countries. And I think this is often, there is a lack of focus on this in my view. Because all I see is that so many of our clients have all these demands made of them on the environment. There's very few questions being asked, actually, what are you doing to fund these new technologies? By the way, where are you thinking about putting this new plant, and how is it going to help ensure there's a balanced economy in terms of wealth and prosperity in that particular country? That is never a question that is asked.
No, it's critically important. You're right. I mean, Greta's spot on about the problem, but the solutions are complicated. And you're right. We have to have a solution for all. Otherwise, we're stuffed, and we'll go backwards because we'll lose the political support to actually bring the solutions in, which, like the Gilets jaunes in France, we can't afford that. Can't afford those sort of backsteps. So fully with you, Chuka, on that. That's a great comment. And of course, the transition stuff is hard. How do we actually change these copies? But it is the job. That is the job, isn't it? How do we take the stuff that needs to survive? I mean, there is some stuff that won't survive. We know that. We're unlikely. We will not be seeing a coal industry in 10, 15 years' time, unfortunately, at least the coal industry in terms of generating power. We know that. But we're still going to need oil. We need to figure out how to reduce emissions and how to shift those oil industries to other sectors, how to redeploy those engineers. This is let alone in every other sector of the economy. So you're absolutely right. And I guess that's one of the things that that is really exercising our mind at the moment, how to tackle the tough stuff.
I've been thinking, I mean, we've done a lot of work and deep thinking in this, and have been working with the sustainability consultancy ERM in thinking about our own targets. So, for example,
Así es. Cuando pensamos, por ejemplo, en nuestras propias metas respecto al sector del petróleo y gas, queremos reducir la intensidad de carbono de ese sector y reducir nuestro portafolio. Creo que esto puede ser alcanzado y que muchas de esas emisiones nos permiten reducir la intensidad de las emisiones en un 69%. Pero en realidad estamos hablando de un volumen muy grande, pero si nos ponemos a pensar en cómo hacerlo y cuáles metas se pueden alcanzar, lo consideramos con mucho cuidado. Bueno, una pregunta más. ¿La COP va a realizarse en el país en el que vives? ¿Qué espera que suceda durante la COP? Naturalmente se trata de política. La COP es un evento político. Bueno, creo que trabajamos con diferentes países, diferentes economías, pero creo que el tema de la transición justa o la cuestión entre una transición justa o injusta, cuando decimos que las economías más ricas podrían financiar la transición y que la transición no sea tan justa, bueno, eso no es algo que podamos solucionar tan rápidamente en una conferencia como la COP. Otro tema importante es la necesidad de realizar eventos de ese tipo. ¿Qué tipo de resolución global se puede tomar en ese ámbito? Recuerdo la crisis global del 2008-2019 y recuerdo que en ese entonces Gordon Brown presidía el G20 y reunió a los principales líderes globales, quienes vinieron a Londres a discutir qué se podría hacer e intentaron acordar un conjunto de medidas. Después del éxito de esa reunión, quedó muy claro que ese tipo de reunión era fundamental. Si Gordon Brown no lo hubiese hecho en ese entonces, la solución no hubiese sido tan efectiva. Por lo tanto, necesitamos que algunos líderes globales lo hagan durante o antes la COP para establecer ciertas reglas. Como ya he dicho, el sector financiero tiene un papel importante que desempeñar y podamos discutir estos temas durante la COP y creo que podemos realizar algunos progresos en estas áreas que nos requieren tanta inversión. Y para finalizar, diría que tengo mucha esperanza porque el ambiente, el entorno en general es muy propicio y todos quieren ver resultados que se pueden poner en marcha. Y recuerdo que la última vez que tuvimos este tipo de acción, en el 2020, si no me equivoco, es una muestra de que estamos avanzando en la dirección correcta. En junio, los ministros de finanzas del G20 asumieron este acuerdo, pero independientemente de lo que piensen del acuerdo, solo el hecho de haber llegado a un acuerdo de las 7 principales economías de las principales economías sobre determinado tema es algo que esperamos ver en la COP, donde estaremos y haremos lo posible para contribuir con ideas y contribuir al debate. Y allá estaremos junto con varios clientes importantes del banco. Muchas gracias, Chuka. Lamentablemente tenemos que cerrar esta sesión. Hubiésemos necesitado del doble del tiempo. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros y gracias por el trabajo que ustedes realizan. No, no lo hago yo, lo hacemos todos nosotros. Es un esfuerzo colectivo. Necesitamos hacer esta transición y necesitamos efectivamente ayudar a las industrias a hacerlo. Eso es vital. Ustedes están correctos y muchos están dándose cuenta de que la industria financiera es crítica para este trabajo y debemos ver cómo a- llegar a donde necesitamos llegar y cómo podemos conectar, llevar el dinero a donde hace falta. Buena suerte. Esperamos que tengan éxito. Muchas gracias por participar en esta charla. Muchas gracias.